Hello, everyone. Thanks to Interlocutories, the first ever student organized event from the New Center. If you are unfamiliar with us, especially for people who are here, we are a educational research platform created by myself and Jason Adams in 2014 in the United States. We have been concerned with the relationship between technology, philosophy, politics, and art, and have had many seminars organized exclusively online and some in physical space like this throughout the last 5 years. We actually are almost done with our 5th year of operation. We have a public program which allows us to offer the world through our YouTube page the first session of all of our seminars for free. The rest of our content is available to our members and people who commit to the New Center for a particular seminar or a full year of a program. We're a nonprofit society, and we operate as an educational institution registered in Michigan. And we also have a teaching license in the state of Washington. The interesting thing about what we do is that we utilize this category of technical school in many states in the United States, which is not really a college, it's not really a university, and it's where you learn technical skills. So like typing or plumbing. It's really developed for this type of like hands-on education where you get a job after. So we somehow slide through the cracks and convince that what we do is very technical. So we could actually operate like a technical school. So we don't offer degrees, and we are not planning to move towards offering degrees. So we kind of like operate this very like interesting space in which we think what we do is kind of like more rigorous than a lot of university programs that offer philosophy, that offer political thought, or offer like art theory programs. Not just because we're interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary and we allow our students or researchers to move easily between seminars that have completely different focus, but because you actually learn how to give presentation, how to write, things that you normally don't learn in university unless you really have your own prerogative to learn those things while you're there. Most people who come out of the programs still will lack a lot of the skills required to actually belong to the world of intellectual production. So we do think that like what we do is kind of like it's like you learn how to like fix plumbing, but in philosophy. So so I use this metaphor to explain what we do, and people who are here have gathered actually from quite different corners of the world. We have researchers from Seattle, Washington, who flew for the event to Berlin. We have people from London, from Amsterdam, who are with us, who came here. And today's program consists of series of conversations between our researchers / certificate students with one of their instructors. And it's basically an ongoing dialogue that they've already started in seminars or in one-on-one sessions. And they basically have summarized it to a very brief question and brief responses by the instructors. So this way, it's both useful for them, but also it's a good way of public to see what we actually do and what do we have to offer. And we have a few of our instructors are live, and students are live here, and some are online. So the conversations are organized in a way that like one person is here and one person's online. So either the instructor's here and the student's online, or the vice versa. And our website address, thenewcenter.org, and the center is spelled the British way or Canadian way, not the American way, so thenewcenter.org. You can take a look at the program, what we've done in the past, and what we're planning to do this semester. Our classes begins February 9th with a series of seminars by some of the leading artists in the field of contemporary art, who will be talking about their methodologies. And there will be other seminars as the spring season kind of like kicks in. There's going to be more seminars coming. And I would like to actually, since this is a student-initiated project, I would like to pass it on to Natalie, who actually was the person who suggested we should take part in Vorspiel and did all the paperwork. And so today we have Natalie and Alan, who's from Mexico City, will be kind of chairing the online part, and Natalie, who will be chairing it from here in the room. And if I may, we already have one of our lovely instructors, Anne-Françoise Schmid, kind of like listening on. You can see the little picture. She's a fabulous, wonderful philosopher from Paris, and she will be interacting in one of the upcoming panels, right? Not the second one, but the third one, right? Yeah, the second one. Yeah. So I'm gonna pass it on to Natalie, and then maybe Natalie and Alan can do a little bit of introductory, and then we will get to the first session.
Thank you, Mo. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, everybody, for being in the Hangout as well. My name is Natalie. I joined the New Center as a student about a year and a half ago, brought on by various thinkers and writers, some of whom are in the room today. And Parallel Academia is a group within the New Center, which is for those students who do not necessarily want to dedicate their lives to academia, but want to continue studying, continue learning, continue reading, and discussing theories and contemporary theories. This is why we at Parallel Academia, this small group of students, got together over various time zones, trying to organize and coordinate all of this. At a certain point, we were in a hangout with, hangout with someone in Berlin. So Mo, myself, some others in London, somebody in Alaska, Barrett, somebody in Greece, Artemis, and Mikey in Seattle. So, and Yaminay in Pakistan, which is actually incredible. So across time zones, we have tried to put everyone in the same room, and this is our aim with Interlocutories, to give people the opportunity to discuss and present their research along with a thinker that relates to what they do. Alan is in Mexico City, and he will present the speakers briefly and the pairs. The way that we'll organize this is, I'll relate the groups. The first group is media and the senses. The second group is politics and technology, and the third group is mapping cognition with various abstracts in between. So go ahead, Alan, and you will introduce yourself and your approach and the speakers, and then we can start with Stefan Heidenreich and Yaminay Chaudhry, who's joining us from New Haven, Connecticut. Alan, unmute yourself, don't forget. Alan.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, my name is Alan Diaz, and I am an architect from Mexico City. I am currently a certificate program student in the program of critical philosophy in the New Center for 6 months now, I believe. And well, before reading the pairs of speakers who are going to speak today, I want to thank again everyone from the Parallel Academia group for their efforts. As Natalie said, it was a lot of coordinations between different time zones and a lot of communication and logistics. But I would also like to thank the instructors for their great disposition to participate in these short conversations. So, as Natalie said, there are 3 modules, which are media and the senses, politics and technology, and mapping cognition. And the speakers, in order, they are paired. As she said, it's a student with an instructor. The first one will be Stefan Heidenreich with Yaminay Chaudhry. Second one is Anne-Françoise Schmid and Artemis Papachristou. Third one is Reza Negarestani and Michael Wells. Fourth one, which is already the second module, will be Jaya Breck and Terence Sharp. Next is Davon Loeffler and Barrett Abner. Next is Tom Moynihan and Meredith Finkelstein. And then third module will be Aaron Schuster and Valentin Golev, Daniel Sashilotto and Andrea Giuseppe Ragno. And last will be Benjamin Bratton and Leonardo de la Noche. So, without further ado, I would like to present the first speakers from the first model, which, as I said, is Yaminay, Chaudhry, and Stefan Heidenreich. I will read a brief bio from them both. If you want to read the full bios, you can read them in the program. So, Yaminay is a multimedia artist from Pakistan, founder of the Tentative Collective in Karachi. Her collaborative and individual works have been shown in various museums around the world, most recently in the Tate Seminar in Karachi. Stefan is a Berlin-based theorist who writes about art, media, and economy. His recent books, which are written in German, are Money for a Non-Money Economy, which is an outline of an utopian economy based on algorithmic distribution, and also Birthday, How We Became to Celebrate Ourselves, which is a cultural history of a ritual at the intersection of subjectivity and data. They are going to speak about the potential for insurgency by both images and humans resisting the capitalizations of futures. So to start, I will show a video Yaminay sent us. I will share my screen so everyone can see it. One moment. Okay, so I will now hand the mic to Yaminay.
Hi, can you hear me? All
Yes.
right. Hi, everyone. This is Yaminay. The clip that you just saw was an excerpt from one of my works called There Was Nothing, Kuch Bhi Nahi Tha. The video was shot along a 4-mile stretch of beach, a public beach in Karachi, which is one of Karachi's most important public commons. Currently, this site is being encroached upon by a city-sanctioned plan to redevelop the entire coastline. So very recently, if you were following Pakistani news, there's been a very brutal anti-encroachment drive led by the state on informal settlements across the city. And several thousands of businesses have been destroyed in the process, which is an absurd strategy for a city where 70% of the labor works in the informal sector. In the meanwhile, the mostly illegal encroachments of the public beaches by that same state have continued unabated. So I'm going to read a little text. I'm an artist, so I make videos and I write with reference to some of the things that are happening in the city of mine. I'm going to read a little fragment of a text called Low Res, which imagines the same beach in the future as one exhausted periphery of the city, a landscape of endless waste with some possibility for agency. The night after the spectacle, on an abandoned stretch of sand, between the power plant and the concrete fishing village, between the Arabian Sea and the glossy towers, Mountains of SD cards, micro SD cards, with rusty teeth, lay in heaps under the moon. Their metal components released elements collected from the stars above and the grounds below. Inside them, silicon amassed low-res images gathered from a place much like Calvino's Leonia. Meanwhile, shapeless scavengers from the north sifted gently through this rubble, carefully lifting chips into containers filled with desiccant. Their probes gorged on moist bodies, fragments of the uncertain past, unstable bits of third-class modernity, plastic casings sealing shut charged atoms that once stood in formation to create pictures. Those charged atoms were rearranging themselves now, moving in different directions, like a crowd after a flash performance, metamorphosing into new images, but without any reference. So let's go back to the present, to the disappearing beach in Karachi, and think about why these kinds of encroachments are happening across the region and how we can think about insurgency in the wake of such events. I mean, one of the reasons clearly is aspirations for worlding and the projecting of images of Karachi or other cities as global cities primed for speculative investment. This leaves us with questions about how an insurgency can be imagined when the main obstacle to insurgency is complicity in capitalization. And this happens across class. For incursions of capital to flow into new markets, no matter how remote, as soon as these incursions happen, the working class start to aspire for the same things as the middle and upper classes. And it doesn't matter how self-destructive it is. So the caveat is, given capital's endless hunger for representation, meme, and idea, no matter how radical, the only place to turn to might be the unrepresentable image and the unrepresentable thought, which almost implies a turning away from the public sphere. Because if, as Bifo Berardi says, the encroachments of capital have taken control of our minds, how can we even think of strategies of insurgency? In this brief conversation with Stefan, there are further questions to be asked. How can the insurgent rebel against capital flows, realizing its own paradoxical complicity? Is there a potential for insurgency to grow from within? And what could insurgent images look like if they refuse to represent? So with that, excited to speak to Stefan.
Hi, Yaminay.
Hello, hello.
So we've been discussing that that topic the last few days, actually, back and forth. And looking at it now, I would like to address it from question 3. I would like to start with question 3, because there is the one obvious thing, where we can ask ourselves about the insurgency and the complaints of French politicians that the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, have no representative to talk to. So maybe that is not the representation that we think, but I mean, you were saying in your text that the non-representation means to withdraw from the public. But actually, one could also say it's the opposite, that the non-representation is the new mode of addressing the public. And denying representation is exactly the way that an insurgency, in order to be successful, has to go. When we didn't discuss that during the last days, but that's one thing that I came across. And then there's another funny point that I want to make. We've been discussing the poor image quite a bit, and the idea of the poor image, and then we actually were saying, no, we don't have poor images any longer, because we're not in the, so to say, Hito-style times any longer. We are the technical means are better. But just now, when we showed your video, actually what we saw of your video was a poor image, because it was translated by Skype into a poor image here. So, and that, I don't know exactly what to make out of it, but it seems we still have poor images, maybe by accident, I don't know. So that's, if you like, react to the two things. We said we're doing rather back and forth. So that the non-representation, the one question is, could it be that the non-representation is actually the means for going forward with the public insurgency? Example is being the yellow vest, and the accidental poor image is actually still living with us and it's not yet gone. So we have to wait a little bit for when it's gone. And what that means, I don't know exactly. You want to reply to that?
Yeah, I think the yellow vests are a very good example of the unrepresentable image, because it's not clear why the yellow vest. They're not furnishing an explanation per se, and that's great. But what I was referring to also was the unrepresentable thought, and the idea that every time somebody comes up with a radical scheme or a meme or an idea, it immediately gets corporatized and it immediately gets subsumed by capital. And so this sort of communication of thoughts, of any kind of rebellion or insurgency, when communicated in social space, just become taken over. So how do we avoid that? How do we still think when our minds are so sort of, easily co-opted? And that to me implies a turning away from the public sphere to sort of become more private per se,
Yeah. Okay. How to say? There, my impression is okay that about the non-representation. There's two things. Okay, we have to question whether the being taken by the capital means automatically that the insurgency fails. Like the mainstreaming the resistance was even a topic in the 70s. In the 68, after 68, the same thing happened, that you had that, so to say, insurgency that then was immediately commodified. And maybe my impression is that this is inevitable, and then somehow the withdrawal to the private, or as we have been discussing yesterday, that the so to say the way out of B4, which is suicidal, is so to say that would also kill the insurgency straight. So that can't be really the way to go. And then there is another idea about the representation. If you think of it, I mean, it's maybe a, so to say, a little bit blunt reading of Robert Brandon, but you can of course take the whole idea of doesn't matter. It's not about what we represent to create philosophical meaning or meaning in general by doing stuff which is an Einstein thing. The meaning of a word is what we do with it. That's not the correct translation in English, but der Gebrauch eines Wortes, the use of a word defines its meaning. That would be closer to what he said. And the emphasis is there on the use that is being made of instead of the representation. So thinking about representation, we are already always from the very beginning on the wrong track. We basically fall into a philosophical mindset that enforces us into that kind of thinking through representations, whilst actually the insurgency would be about doing something rather. But then again, we're back at the yellow vest issue, to say for sure this is not a representation, it's not a flag that represents a movement, but it's rather something, it's rather a sign of emergency, which it was, because every car driver was supposed to have one of those yellow vests in the car, and that it was taken up as a symbol of the insurgency was like by accident, so to say, and in a double meaning, by accident, because somebody was working. Actually, there was that lorry driver in France, in France somewhere, Drouet, who met a friend, and the friend had the yellow vest on, and he was from there. He took it like, okay, why not using that? So accident in a double sense, but that so to say, where the representation grows out of doing something, and that's the non-representation. That would be a non-representation that is totally, how to say, public. or is by making public or an act of doing that is then being made public and only later on grows into representation. And if we understand it from the representation side, we're already misunderstanding it. Difficulty is how we could ever translate that, and that's also beyond my scope to answer, to the insurgency or the possible insurgency that can grow in a city like Karachi on the beach. Whether this is an example that only can exist in a, let's say, Western media sphere, or whether that you can imagine that to be translatable into a situation like in Pakistan. I cannot assess that. What do you think?
Well, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that with capitalism and with the flows of capitalism, with media coming in, with cell phones coming in, with the use of platform capitalism like Instagram and Facebook, the sort of aspirations for modernization, progress, development are shared by everyone. So the local, a sense of a local and a specific are disappearing really rapidly. And so, you know, going back to that kind of complicity as that one obstacle in creating an insurgency is that there is that paradox of activism where a rebel who is standing up against capital flows is inherently, paradoxically consuming capital and is very much a part of it and supports it. And so, you know, as somebody living in Karachi and trying to resist capitalization, I use all the tools of this same, you know, wave of you know, incursion. So where does this insurgent stand? Where does this insurgent, how does it exist against and provide any kind of resistance against capital flows when it's very much consumed by the flows themselves? It's again kind of going back to Bifo's idea that our minds, you know, are colonized by it, right? So there is, that causes the complicity with capital. And then what space is there left while we are holding on to this complicity in capital to be resistant? It's also the same problem that artists have in holding positions of activism in the world of art. And at the same time, paradoxically, not be able to hold on to the ethics of those movements in their personal lives. So what can you say about that?
Okay, that was also one point that we discussed, and it's good that you bring it up. It's the how to say, the relation of insurgency to resistance. And there's that argument that can be made against resistance, to say resistance is futile and resistance is actually the way in order to be eaten up by the capital's interest. And one could also follow from that you say actually in a kind of accelerationist thought, let's rather go with capital for a certain strategic purpose, like with capital against capital. If, let's say that this is the broad assumption, if self-destructive mechanism anyhow, we can also march with it and achieve the goal, maybe better than trying to put the brakes on it. And there, I mean, this is, I don't know exactly where that strategy has been applied successfully. So there's a caveat with accelerationism. I don't know whether it actually works, but maybe it would be. And I couldn't really think of how testing it would look like. But nevertheless, it would be worth thinking about it. I think we're almost at the end of the 15 minutes. So if you have a last word, then we're done.
I would just really, I'm curious about this directed accelerationism that you talk about, because that's one thing that, to me, I don't quite understand. What is the limit of this directed accelerationism? Because, you know, we're talking about Bifo Berardi's option of suicide, and then there's this directed accelerationism. What is it?
you could see one part in the platform capitalism. I go back again, and this is the so to say wrapping it up. Also, the yellow vests, of course, they grow out of Facebook, and at the same point, we know that Facebook is, so to say, the evil frontier of capitalism. So it serves both. It's, as much as Heidegger says, it's the salvation that comes with the danger. That's also so to say, that could be an accelerationist move within insurgency.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yaminay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Stefan. We will pass on the microphones to Artemis Papachristou and Anne-Françoise Schmid. Alan, feel free to present them at any time. Don't forget to unmute your.
Okay, so yep. Artemis Papachristou is an architect and artist from Greece, currently researching the inhabitation patterns of contemporary digital nomads. Anne-Françoise Schmid is a philosopher of science and a specialist in Poincaré. She has taught at the University of Paris, West Nanterre, and at the University of Genova. Artemis and Anne-Françoise will talk about digital art as an integrative object.
Hello to you all here online. Bonjour, Madame Françoise.
Hello, Artemis.
So after having the opportunity to take part in some of your seminars at the New Center for Research and Practice called Philosophical Inventions and the Silence of the Future, I had the chance to get in touch with your work and your way of thinking concerning the field of philosophy of science. So through the sessions we had, and after reading your text, Generic Epistemology, Conception, and Interdisciplinarity, I came across the term integrative object. So in early times in philosophy of sciences, an object or a theme was studied through the lens of only one discipline, and it was correlating with one theory. In the contrary, a contemporary object is so complex that this approach is not sufficient, as it usually involves many disciplines. I will quote a part of your text on contemporary objects in order to present the term integrative object. I have proposed a way of treating this problem, which is to admit in the relative autonomy all the ingredients that one encounters in science, without placing them into that structure by rendering them generic. That is to say, relatively independent to the disciplines in which they happen to be constituted. We must therefore open up the epistemological field of science. The contemporary objects are non-objects, which no longer oppose subject and object across a phenomenological distance. I have called these integrative objects. They are unknown. We have to treat them as an unknown X, and they are never entirely encountered by the disciplines. In fact, we cannot ever put the pieces together and entirely synthesize them. None of the disciplinary characterizations gives a rule for unity for the whole of the object. The integrative object is not a limitation of classical knowledge, but a treatment through a treatment of knowledges of this X type, whose effects are distributed in different modes and without synthesis. Through this approach, we can make partially in science, in art, in philosophy, aspects that were treated separately. And we can separate aspects that were overhastily identified with each other. The distinction between art, science, philosophy is no longer given, but reconstructed via hypothesis. As far as I understand it, a contemporary object is now no longer a product, and becomes an activator, a controller, and actually changes the rules of the game, let's say. And in this way, it demands a new way of studying it. As we discussed it also in the seminars, this method can also be applied in the field of art, especially in the field of contemporary art, that we have new technologies and the digital, and the use of the digital. So my first question is how actually the term integrative object can be applied in art, and how do you think the new technologies have created a new new methodologies and new way of studying art? You also mentioned the work of the artist John Gerard as an example of how a contemporary work of art can act as an integrative object. He has been working a lot with new technologies and different ways of simulating the real, and his work has reached methodologically, but also we will say with meaning semiologically. So can you please elaborate on this example, or if you have another artist in mind, we can talk about it, how a contemporary work of art with a lot of ways of presenting it itself can be described as an integrative object.
Thank you, Artemis. Hello, Artemis. Yes, it's a very good question. Yes. As you say, Artemis, we will treat these questions with an operational concept, that of integrative object, that we have been able to develop in the field of science as well as in that of art and philosophy. The philosophies, science, arts, and even technologies can no longer be self-modeled or auto-modeled. They come in multiple forms. And the concept of complexity, which presupposes a convergence of disciplinary perspectives of an object, is no longer enough in the face of the extraordinary mixtures of interdisciplines, temporalities, intentions, and creations that set in motion an increasingly dissociated social life. The main characteristic of contemporary objects is without synthesis. It is not actually an ontological conception, but more a process to understand what is contemporary. In science, we can no longer simply articulate research on obesity or cancer. The complexity of science no longer allows us to believe that epistemology is directly related to science. It indirectly participates through the creation of a generic space in the apprehension of knowledge flows of various kinds. In the same way, we cannot describe with a single register a work of art, such as that of John Gerard, at the same time as an image, an information technology, computer science, virtual dance, game of war, video games, stable and moving at the same glance. Or the work of James Turrell, both natural and artificial, a volcano and a pool, the sky and the sea, color and darkness, for the creation of such an art. What is needed can also the work of Pierre Huyghe, actually a set of works in the same place, animated by the movement of the spectators. His exhibition at the Pompidou Center in Paris was a real integrative object, whose apparent unity was continually reformed, but with surprise and cuts in front of everyone. In this case, to be a spectator is to participate in the work which does not only happen to the artist, but to everyone while being in motion. The dark cogito of the contemporary world. We are immersed in the effects of science and works of art come from 1,000 sources. Artists not only realize, but especially they allow us to recognize them as such, as explained by the painter Benoit Mer. The artist is the one who first recognizes that a work is a work of art. Without this, we would have trouble distinguishing them from a colorful usage image. Kant said that art is a creation without concept. Now, there is a lot of overlapping between sciences. Each object has many dimensions, hypothesis or fiction. It can be at the same time dance, philosophy, computer science, telluric, like the work of John Gerard. There is no longer a philosophy of science, more of philosophy of art. The of is not only superfluous, but it distorts the question of the relation of philosophy to other disciplines and more generally disciplines between them. Philosophy does not fly over them, or it does just very little. It juxtaposes itself to others with the same weight as the other. It is clearly seen in today's interdisciplinary regimes, which articulate fragments of science and knowledge. Their links may be of philosophy, aesthetics, epistemology, or any disciplines that we treat as sub-determinative. A new use of negation. This situation leads to a new use of negation. It's no longer only a question of exclusion, but that of extension. A non-synthetic method in science and art displays negation and completes it by a creative and inventive use of the without. From the verb, it came of the noun, non-philosophy or non-music, or on the adjective, non-standard philosophy, non-standard mathematics. This makes it possible to find and invent what one did not know about science or philosophy by an inventive without. What is science without a discipline? What is philosophy without the transcendental? What is mathematics without a structure or without an object? This method allows us to enrich our idea of sciences, philosophies, and mathematics because it forces us to replace by another discipline what has been removed by hypothesis. It also brings us to a new use of with, where concepts are formed as such by philosophers and scientists and artists. This change on the method is fundamental. The philosophy, the science, the art are no longer a given, but an X for which we postulate a number of properties from which we remove by hypothesis the most important. The addition one is led to make is no longer in the object, it is artificially secured, but with rigor and without the guarantee of the synthesis. For example, it is no longer necessary to assume that a GMO is a product of molecular biology. It is no longer characterized by a natural object plus a genetic manipulation. Let's treat it like an X. Bring together all the disciplines concerned by the supposed impacts. Treat them democratically with the same weight. This will be based on each disciplinary iteration, a transformation of what we apprehend as GMO, ethics, will no longer be a culmination of scientific discussion by an integrated discipline from the beginning of the research. The GMO will no longer be a product, but the realization of the intention of research collectives and all the professions concerned. Common language and computer science. Similarly, the integrative objects make it possible to articulate the elements of language and the symbol of computer science. The language symbols deepen the notions and relate them to the real. The symbols of logic and computer science relate them to the results of simulations. This is what Frank Varenne calls the simulacra. These are not the same relations to the real, and these two reals together constitute our contemporary objects. They deal with both structures through mathematics and ontologies by computer science. They are dealing with the most abstract statistics as well as the common sense. Obesity, for example, articulates without synthesis the statistics of human intestinal microbiota and common sense knowledge. As a general rule, scientific research objects designated by common language words can be analyzed by these procedures. The concept of integrative object is not fixed or given. It's a procedure to understand the contemporary object with other means than with the classical epistemology, mostly projected on contemporary science. Techniques partially unknown, constructed by hypotheses and by fictions, in connection with the intention of the collective of researchers, it supposes a superposition of heterogeneous knowledge and non-knowledge, which cannot be reduced by a discipline, whether it is mathematical or computer science. It does not apply. It's just a compass of orientation in the forests and oceans of the knowledge and the arts, what we create. I will end with a philosophical fantasy, which could be addressed to each of us, strategist, curator, philosopher, or artist, on the dry and the wet as the fragment of ecology for our earth. Interdiscipline on the earth and on the sea. There is a dry interdisciplinarity. The strategist converged fragment of science on a virtual continent. Perhaps a new discipline. The guiding question will be that of a supposedly common language equal X. From an art, from the X of the art, philosophy from the X of philosophy. There is a wet interdisciplinarity, richer, probably close to the earth, but wet in the waters of a science and a larger art, whose melody forms a set of small perceptions that isolated disciplines do not have and do not perceive. The problem will be on the identity of the object that this interdisciplinarity creates. The guiding question of the strategist or curator, then, will be to create a space where objects, partially solid, partially liquid, with their continuities and cuts, peaks and strews, we will find their way of interpreting this small perception created by the waves of science, philosophy, and art, but without ever being able to completely synthesize them. That makes interdisciplinarity the generic foundation of their relationship. The strategist or the curator and the philosopher. On Earth, The strategist must be an attentive surveyor to the entire territory, doing the impossible, that is, to put side by side in the local and global thinking. On the ocean, the strategist must also be a sailor, building his boat while sailing. To be both a surveyor and a sailor is also to be a philosopher. One says of him that he falls on the earth when he looks at the stars, but he lets himself to be guided by them when he moves on the ocean of metaphysics. And yet, in metaphysics, there is no line of sight to orient oneself. Kant said this. The philosopher falls where he's lost. What strategy and what care is needed to avoid this risk, not fall, not get lost? Imagine an interdisciplinary without philosophy, which could be that of curator of art, a kind of interdisciplinary of the future. We do not know it yet, of course, but we can know the rupture it can cause in our good old interdisciplinarity, because the future is not only a time, but a mode of apprehension. The future will allow us to distance and give meaning to all of these metaphors that form this landscape in our culture, art, and even agriculture of sorts. And yet, there is always an oversight, the contingency of the separation of water and earth. A 17th century philosopher, Malebranche, shows it in the form of the rain. How is it that rain falls on the oceans where it is not so necessary? Our morality, since we are telling a fable, is that the interdisciplinary strategist and the curator of contemporary art must never forget then they are both on the land and on the water, and that they can only act that they know the impossibility. They need a phase of interdisciplinarity which force them to take into account the contingency or the orientation of the Rhine between the earth and the sea, which the ancients called the cleaner man. This cleaner man is not a decline, but a declination and the conjugation of new science, new forms of art and philosophies, where each fragment of disciplines will be an occasion for the creation of other unexpected fragments. Thanks to Leibniz, Malebranche, Kant, the ancient philosophers and the contemporary philosophers who have given a new value to the metaphor and verticality. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Artemis.
Merci, Anne-Françoise. Thank you so much. We will now pass on, thank you, Artemis. We will pass on the microphone to Reza Negarestani, who is in New Haven, Connecticut, if I'm not mistaken, and to Michael Wells, who came here from Seattle. Alan, would you like to do an introduction about each of them before they start?
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. I will read their bios briefly. So Michael is an independent writer and researcher with a background in the culinary arts, as well as the owner and operator of Aleatory Books in Seattle. Reza Negarestani is a philosopher. He has contributed extensively to journals and anthologies and lectured at numerous international universities and institutes. His current philosophical project is focused on rationalist universalism. Michael and Reza are going to talk about the knowledge world-building potential of experience creation in the culinary arts. So I will pass the mic to Michael now. Yep.
Alan, please mute who's not talking. Thank you.
All right, it is the aim of this brief presentation to examine and raise questions on the potential of the senses via flavor as a synthesis operation while looking to philosophy to further explore and intensify this potential. Flavor is an act of sense synthesis made explicit. It leans primarily on taste and smell via the 5 present taste categories: sour, sweet, salty, bitter, and umami, along with the infinitely complex web of aromatic compounds. Information from hearing, seeing, and touch influence the reception of the taste and smell experience through expectations and physical interactions. All this flavor experience would be meaningless without language, memory, intellect, culture, and imagination in which each works to construct and reinforce categories that guide the use of the senses and the intelligibility of the world. Flavor brings about a confrontation with the world that exemplifies the active and extended self. It is a sensuous relationship between the self and the world immersed in language, culture, history, and reason. Flavor descriptions operate by positioning itself against an experience from the past or a learned language category. It is clear when someone says they taste peach in a glass of wine that there is no real peach in there, nor is there any illusion that there might be so. It instead calls back to a memory of experience as well as agreed upon linguistic terms under social and historical conditions. It is the use of language as description. A glass of wine begins to take shape. At the same time, the use of the descriptor peach fortifies the category of peach flavor and generalizes it. There should be an understanding that when a descriptor is employed, the person has a firm grounding to do so. The mastery of language is appropriate for the culture and historical moment. They would also have to have a grasp on the flavor category, both by experience and normative use. Without having the linguistic experiential grounding, the utterance of the descriptor would be meaningless. The possibility for error in describing flavor comes from the misunderstanding and misuse of normative linguistic categories. Falsifiability must be brought to the table to create discourse and validity. This methodological approach is not to be aimed at the contents within the object nor examine the senses directly. Instead, the critical lens examines the use of language to build a representation of the phenomena of sensation. By judging the validity of a claim, falsifiability works alongside real-world results. An active application of flavor speculation in the world still reveals nothing of the object nor the sense in itself, but only works back to intensify and refine knowledge. This process can further build on a possible representation of truth and strip away what does not align with the world it is applied. The concepts that are used to construct representation are what is at stake here. Information from this testing and application informs the active and representational building of the self. The methodologies and concepts employed are influenced and manipulated by real-world conditions, which are only indirectly accessible by the effects generated by an active self. When the concept does not hold up in the world, it is to be further elaborated on and not merely thrown away. Plasticity allows the concept to reform, recombine, splinter, and shatter to bring about new knowledge. Flavor extends outwards via dialectical speculation and practice. The representational model must be applied out into the world where it may become falsifiable. Imagination can play a role in this, as it can speculate about combinations and applications, but is not sufficient to create falsifiability without further extension. I now look to philosophy, not to find answers, but to utilize them as explorers and creative forces that allow new knowledge to emerge to add to the understanding of flavor. The philosopher is employed as an alchemist, utilizing knowledge and intensifying concepts from across disciplines to see what possibly emerge from an investigation into flavor. The senses are to be pushed to their limits, not simply observed to uncover potential and knowledge. Are the senses our access or a barrier to the world? How does language play into this? Through the history of philosophy, the self, the world, and how they connect have had little headway in terms of truth, but layers of knowledge continue to grow. Within the debate and investigation, the, the, the senses have been explored and dissected. Out of the 5 presently available for investigation, seeing and hearing have been propped up in the epistemological and ontological pedestal, while taste, smell, and touch have been relegated to the bottom of the sensuous pile, where they scrape together basic information that give little more than information on pleasure or pain. Aside from the grunt work, they are heavily influenced by the conditions at hand, such as language available, societal status, technological innovation, and history. Taste, smell, and touch are heavily conditioned via acclimation by present states of being. But what does the inside of our mouth taste like? What does the room smell like after a short while sitting in it? But can't the same be said about sight and sound? The world we do not see is the world we are acclimated to. The hum in the background and the haze in the air. What would happen if the senses are leveled, allowing for change, modification, and different senses to take the mantle at times to lead the self to new knowledge? It seems that an intelligible reality is a synthesis with indirectly accessible real-world conditions forming a material reality of the self as other. Linguistic, social, and historical conditions potentiate an active and discursive self. Flavor can act as a model and build a practice of this relation, which one investigates himself dialectically as an object to make judgments from the relation and an interaction with the world. Briefly touch upon a question asked a moment ago on if the senses are the access or barrier to the world. To me, it seems like both, but the senses should be viewed as an active application of the self in the world, along with language and the categories, concepts that activate and articulate the world and the self.
Reza, would you like to answer to this? Alan, please unmute Reza.
Reza, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, yes, I did. Sorry. So I have 10 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Michael, for fantastic presentation. So I'm going to create a kind of rather fantastical, prosthesis from basically the argument that Michael presented. Essentially, what I call, basically some conjectures on culinary materialism, in the sense that looking into the history of alchemy, but also the history of science, model building, even today's architecture, and by the architecture I don't mean architecture as a specific discipline, but simply as a generalized form of construction. We see that we are essentially always working with what Nelson Goodman in his book Ways of World Making calls projectables or projectiles. I will of course talk more later on what these things are. So projections are what you might call to be these culinary products. Of course, they are not edible, but nevertheless, they are exactly like the alchemical processes. Certain kinds of product which is still undergoing through some sort of processual change. Part of them is entirely made of sensory perception, and the other part of them is made of cognitive, conceptual, symbolic elements. Best way to imagine a projectile is Nelson Goodman's famous projectable adjectives called grue and bleen or blight. In his new riddle of induction, he introduces grue or bleen like this, that emeralds before time t are green, emeralds after time t1, hypothetical date, are blue. So green and blue. green before, blue thereafter. And Boolean, the same thing. Blue before time t1, green afterwards. Or black and white, blight. Now, of course, why is that we are not seeing GRU emeralds? We are only seeing green emeralds. Well, because we are living in worlds in which we are only having entrenched, habituated predicates such as green, blue, black, and white. But imagine if we could, in fact, make a world in which we can use GRU. It tastes like GRU. It tastes like bleen. It smells like blight. So this is how Nelson Goodman begins his work on speculative methods or operations through which we can, in fact, make worlds. And making a world is not a capricious business. As he says, every ways of world making is essentially a way of not knowing. So it is constrained by a knowledge procedure. But of course, these knowledge procedures, just like the worlds, are both constrained by the old ingredients of the old worlds from which we set out or embark on our project, but also new constrained introduced from new compositions, new worlds. So what are these operations for world making? Very short list in which we can actually create a new perceptual noetic poles, such as GRU and bleen, or projectiles. So the first one is composition and decomposition, which are operations by which things are taken apart and put together to make ever more new part-whole relationships, taxonomies, classes, subclasses of entities and their features, whose combination results in the construction of complexes and the specific connections they afford. For example, think of how predicates of smell can be applied to predicates of color to create synesthetic predicates, or metaphorical analogical transfers which integrate the boundaries of two different kinds of gestures, models, pictures, ideas, etc., such as the mechanical method of Archimedes, by which geometrical problems are interpreted mechanically. The solution provided in the realm of mechanics is translated into a solution for the geometrical problem. Composition and decomposition, so, is the first operation by which we can make world, provides basis for identification of entities and their features according to the overall organizational scheme of a world system. Two, the operation of weighting, which allows worlds to partition relevant and irrelevant classes of entities and features, such that what is a relevant class for one world might be an irrelevant class for another. The question of how long does it take for the Earth to revolve around the Sun is a relevant class of problem in the Copernican system, but not in the Ptolemaic one. Likewise, the question of how long does it take for the Sun to revolve around the Earth is irrelevant in the Ptolemaic system, but not in the Copernican framework. So categorical schemata which portray the body of Christ, even the lines, folds, shades, can become fundamentally different as a result of different kinds of emphasis or weights in paintings made by, for example, Grunwald or Raphael. Three, the operation of ordering is an operation that mainly concerns with the order of derivation within a constructional framework. The order of derivation of points with respect to the Euclidean and non-Euclidean systems are different. In the Euclidean framework, point can be either given elements, intuitive axioms, or the result of an elementary construction over other axiomatic data, lines intersecting, for example. But in the non-Euclidean worlds, the order of derivation can be fundamentally different, and therefore the cognitive machineries specific to that ranking or the order of derivability in the system can also be different. Worlds possess hierarchies of construction or the order of derivation. Such hierarchies demarcate, limit, and enable transition from one perceptual or cognitive ability or machinery to another. For example, think of different hierarchies of the formal grammar, Chomsky's formal grammar. You can alternatively imagine two symphonies as worlds apart by their orders of derivation or tonal scales. Just as shapes differ in the order of derivation in geometrical worlds, rhythms and perceptual encounters they bring about differ in tonal worlds. Patterns, auditory and spatial, insofar as the base receptive fields for such signals can mechanically and topologically overlap, as in our own neurological setup, perceived under a 12-tone scale vary from those perceived under an 8-tone scale. Fourth is the process of deletion and supplementation. Every world making in one way or another requires a procedure of erasing or weeding out and filling the gaps with new materials. The worlds made by deletion and supplementation are worlds which increasingly supply our cognitive armamentarium with new methods of construction, new anticipations, new ways out of the established order of things. Think about how Cubism erases the elements of the classical figurative painting. But to the extent that in the way of world making, erasing is not enough, what is erased should be often replaced by new supplements. Every figure loses something, but also is supplemented with new lines and diagrammatic configurations. Or take, for instance, the shift from the analog to digital computer or computation should be seen as a veritable world making. In this process, the continuities are deleted. We are now in the domain of pure mechanizability, discrete inputs, discrete states, and discrete outputs. This shift, realized by deletion, is a radical one. The very distinction of the human and machine begins to collapse. The human world will be revealed as nothing from this point of view, but a special kind of integration of computational processes. 5, the formation or reshaping can involve either correction or distortions, or both. For example, think of an engineer who does not directly intervene with a metal beam at the level of crystal structure, but develops an approximation or normalization technique, essentially a controlled distortion, whereby he can manipulate the beam sufficiently at a less fine-grained or detailed level of analysis and intervention. Or take, for instance, Boltzmann's gas theory, in which earlier works of classical thermodynamics, as developed by Carnot, Clausius, and others, are corrected in a generalizing fashion. But also in this framework, the thermal elements are reshaped and reinvented as statistical elements: position, velocity, momentum of particles, statistical ensembles, so on and so forth. So the list of such world-making operations might not be exhaustive, or even compulsory. But through a specification, diversification, and employment of such operations, different kinds of worlds can be crafted. In the precise sense of the culinary experimentations that Mikey was talking about. Now, not only other worlds, but also increasingly alien worlds, albeit intelligible in principle, can be created, where at once our existing perceptual, cognitive, and acting abilities are challenged, and we become equipped with new modes of perception, cognition, and action. Those projectiles, such as green and blue, which were unnatural in our habitat, in our existing world, become habituated. We become habituated to them. They become natural. The result is simply a new encounter with reality, an encounter which is not passive, but the active enrichment and engineering of reality itself, and by extension, the place of ourselves in the worlds. Guzman's thesis is that we construct our reality by projecting predicates onto an existing reality, which is itself made of our ongoing labor of diversification of our own projections in the projectability sense. To end, I would like to read this excerpt from my friend philosopher Adam Berg. World construction is never delineated inside or outside the representational boundaries with its lexical constructs of language. Rather, the fabric of language and codes as well is stretched and expanded to fit better the fluidity between phenomenal and linguistic predicates, perceptual and noetic poles. Accordingly, such predicates are better constructed as projectiles or projections in relation to projections. And as such, there are toy projections. They have massive potential phylogenic agency to generate and influence how we play with them and continue to narrate and navigate such interactions as an ongoing process of projection, which is also the very process of building worlds and enriching reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Reza. We are going to take a quick break, and we will be back with panel 2 on politics and technology. Thank you to the speakers, presenters, both here and elsewhere, and we look forward to seeing you soon again.
Thank you very much.